Spycops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who infiltrated over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Find us online at spycops.info. Episode 47, Reclaim the Street Statement.
So welcome to the Spycops Info Podcast. I'm here in a room with 5 other people. All of us have put our names to a collective statement produced on behalf of Reclaim the Streets for the undercover policing inquiry. That statement has not been published by the inquiry yet. We're really hoping that that's going to be put out in the public domain before Jim Boyling, or HN14 as they call him, turns up to give his evidence on the 9th of February 2026. But as ever with the inquiry, we can't tell for sure if that's going to happen. What we thought we'd do is record this to be able to give a bit of background about who we are, why we're involved in this whole process, some of the issues that we've talked about in our statement, and some of the questions that we hope that Boyling will be asked by the inquiry when he gives his evidence. So we want to first of all explain a little bit about Reclaim the Streets and why we're all involved in this process and what we know about Reclaim the Streets being spied on. So I'm going to be asking the other people who are here with me to maybe talk a little bit about what their involvement in Reclaim the Streets was and what Reclaim the Streets meant to them.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart.
So all of us present were involved in Reclaim the Streets at different varying times throughout its existence, from between 1993 and 2001 broadly. We don't necessarily represent the whole history of RTS, but we gradually have come to understand that we were all spied on by undercover officers working for the Special Branch, Special Demonstration Squad, and that's a process that's taken 16, 17, 18 years to be revealed, and gradually we've learnt more and more about our friends being spied on, our friends being targeted for intimate relationships by these officers. Gradually we've learnt more about the groups that we were involved in being spied on, who the people were who spied on us, which activists that we considered friends turned out to be spies, and this has gradually drawn a lot of us into campaigning around the inquiry and campaigning for more information to be revealed about these officers.
So when this news first broke, some people did campaign for this to be a public inquiry into the undercover policing scandal, and that was set up. It's been a long, very slow process. The inquiry's now been running for over 10 years. It looks set to become probably the longest running and most expensive public inquiry in UK history. And we're still not any closer to getting some of our original demands met, which included give us our files. If the police or the inquiry process gave us our special branch files and let us see for ourselves what had been recorded about us, we'd be a lot closer to knowing the truth about these deployments. As it is, all we've had is little bits of disclosure, information the inquiry's chosen to share with some of us, and not everyone who was spied on has had disclosure at all. We're relatively lucky in that we were given co-participant status in the inquiry. A lot of other people applied to be co-participants, or CPs as they're called, and were turned down, which means they haven't had any information at all. And obviously a lot of people who were involved in RTS over the years didn't even bother applying to be CPs because they had absolutely no faith in the British justice system or public inquiries to start with.
However, gradually, as we've learnt more and more about the officers, more and more people have joined together who were formerly involved in Reclaim the Streets to put together a statement that explained the actions that we took, the campaigns that we were involved in, who the spies were, what actions they were spying on, what they attempted to frustrate that we were doing, and also what they, how they changed the course of our group, and how they targeted us as individuals as well. So I think the officers we're probably going to concentrate on are Jim Boyling, HN14, who used the pseudonym Jim Sutton in Reclaim the Streets, and also Jason Bishop, who that's a cover name, and we don't know his real name as yet.
Yeah, we know his inquiry cipher is HN3, and his SDS awarded code name was Red Herring. And again, we have no idea who made up these code names and why they assigned these particular names to these particular officers. People have got different theories about it.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon the levers.
So I will just I'll talk through a bit about the origins of Reclaim the Streets and what it did in its early years, because I was there at the outset. Reclaim the Streets really emerged out of the road protest movement from the mid-1990s, road protests at Twyford down in Hampshire, then at the M11 Link Road in East London. The last phase of the M11 Link Road campaign was effectively defending a street called Claremont Road, which became a car-free space. We defended it, fortified it with beautiful, visually beautiful things that you could lock onto, but it became a 6-month-long street party, and that gave us this idea to hold further street parties. Now, actually, Reclaim the Streets had a brief incarnation even before the M11 Link campaign, where we painted in cycle lanes, edited car posters, paid some visits to the London Motor Show and things like that. But then we dropped it in order to do the M11 campaign, and then revived it after this idea of street parties. So we held a couple of street parties in the early years. The first 2 street parties, one was at Camden High Street, and the second was at Islington Upper Street, and they were both beautiful days where we let people know that to meet at an advertised meeting place near where the party location was. We didn't tell them where the party was actually going to take place. We had theatrical ways to close those roads, create space for children to play, people to dance, and just have a lovely time with food and lovely banners and so on. At the end of both of those street parties, the police stood back during the street party themselves. We had a lovely afternoon each of those 2 days, but just at the end, when sun was setting and the last people were left, people who were somewhat drunk or taking drugs or whatever, and the police came in and just took the easy pickings of those people, the last people who were left, in order to be able to come and create headlines about it was a riot, but actually it was a police-instigated riot. Then we had and other groups started organising similar parties around the country. We in London planned a huge one, which took place on what was then a motorway, the M41 near Shepherd's Bush. It was by this stage we were also linked up with other groups that were criminalised by the Criminal Justice Bill, with ravers, with squatters, with all sorts of groups. It had about 8,000 people on a party on a motorway. This time, we actively planned to end the party without giving the police that excuse to tarnish our reputation by saying it was a riot at the end. What we now know, though, is that Jim Boyling had now got involved in Reclaim the Streets in the run-up to this party. He was recruited as a van driver. We don't know how much he knew about the plan. He does seem to have known that the plan was to keep it peaceful, and yet the police's justification in his own statement, he said that his justification for being deployed to spy on Reclaim the Streets was because of the alleged widespread disorder at the end of Islington, even though the police knew that there had been nothing of the sort except the stuff that they orchestrated. So one of the questions is that we want the inquiry to ask is, all these allegations of widespread disorder that they made throughout Reclaim the Streets' history actually what were their real reasons for putting so much resource into spying on us? Anyway, I'll hand over to pick up the story as to what then happened after the M41.
So after the M41, about a year later, Reclaim the Streets had been approached by the Liverpool dockers, who were a group of 500 dockers in Liverpool who'd been locked out of work and sacked after a sort of a strike and dispute. And the dockers approached Reclaim the Streets with a request for help, and so Reclaim the Streets from London went up and got involved with the dockers in actions in September 1996. Actions aimed at the organisation that had sacked the company that had sacked the dockers, and there was an occupation of the dock offices and an attempted occupation of the dock itself. So this carried this collaboration, which was an interesting and fruitful a kind of fertilization, a cross-fertilization of like environmental movements, sort of a movement struggling around the environment, around cars, around how space is used, with an older and more traditional sort of trade union organisation, and it was bringing together struggles that to some extent had been suspicious of each other or hadn't had a lot of contact, and kind of making them kind of stronger together and bringing new and interesting forms of kind of taking action and working for social change together. So 7 months after the Liverpool dock action, there was a plan in April 1997 for a festival of resistance, a march for social justice, a collaboration between the dockers and Reclaim the Streets. This was aimed at taking place about 2 to 3 weeks before the 1997 general election, and it was posited not only as a continuing support for the dockers dispute, because they were still locked out from work, but also a kind of festival of possible alternatives, presenting alternatives, different ways that we could actually live, different ways that we could organise the world, and different ways that we could carry out political work, political campaigning, and as opposed to the kind of sterile general election campaign. So on April the 12th, 1997, Reclaim the Streets and the Dockers held a joint march through London, and the plan from Reclaim the Streets' point of view was to follow this march with a weekend with a squat of a large government building, which would then be a venue for political discussion, partying, but as political discussion, a festival of alternative ideas. This plan was known to Jim Boyling, the undercover officer, and this plan was passed to his controllers within Special Branch and passed to the Metropolitan Police, and this plan was thwarted. What happened was the intelligence was passed that the street in which this building was, where the march was aimed to divert and then occupy the building as a kind of surprise occupation. This was heavily fortified by police, so the plan was not allowed to take place. An important point here is that the SDS's whole reason to exist, according to their own set of the way they present themselves, their propaganda, is that these officers are sent into political groups to prevent disorder from taking place, to prevent riots, to prevent people attacking the police, to prevent people fighting with the police, to prevent disorder, disruption. What is interesting about the March for Social Justice and the way the police acted on Jim Boyling's intelligence to prevent the squat from taking place is that what Jim Boyling told his controllers was that if Reclaim the Streets are allowed to take this building and occupy it for the weekend, things will pass off peacefully. If RTS are not allowed to take this building, then they'll be forced to hold a street party, hold a rave in the street, and that disorder will follow. I.e., they knew if Reclaim the Streets couldn't occupy the building, there would be fighting on the street. That was their prediction. In those circumstances, it's worth pointing out that this was an empty building. It was an empty Department of the Environment building. There was no one in the building at the time. It would have been an occupation of an empty building. In these circumstances, it's clear they knew that they were preventing RTS from taking a building peacefully, and that they believed that violence would result. Instead of the Department of the Environment building being taken, a rave took place in Trafalgar Square. Sound systems were driven in, people danced, and then when night fell, a large force of riot police came and dispersed the crowd extremely violently, driving people across Waterloo Bridge with extreme violence. Lots of people were hurt. The people were sort of dispelled into the night, and there was a serious crackdown. The police presented this as disorder caused by RTS. However, it's clear from the police reports in advance that they believed that this would happen. They knew it would happen if the squat wasn't taken, and they were planning for this police action in advance, police crackdown in advance. This is what they present as a great success. Knowing they weren't preventing disorder, knowing they were encouraging it. So our question is, if the SDS, one question we'd like to put to Jim Boyling is this: if the SDS's raison d'etre is to prevent disorder, how come in this instance and other instances they are seen to be conspiring to cause that disorder?
All the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. Got to make it stop. Got to make it stop.
And so, that night in the Evening Standard, there's a press article that says activists attempted murder of a police officer because the van that had the sound system in, which was hired by the undercover cop, not driven by him, drives through a police line, not very fast. And then the whole next day, all the media is just about the riot and not about the issues, which was the first time, really, the red, in a mass way, red, green and black had come together. In fact, the flags that were meant to take us off the route that Alex was describing, there was like several thousand flags made, which were these red, black and green flags, which had different backgrounds. If you were predominantly an anarchist, you would have the black one with the red and green lightning stripe. If you're predominantly a communist, you'd have red with black and green, etc. So we had tried to make we'd made a spoof newspaper the night. We'd spent weeks working on it, and it was meant to be given out to commuters the night before. I think we had 40,000 copies. And it was a spoof of the Evening Standard called Evading Standards, and it basically described all these alternatives that were going to be talked about and illustrated in the what we were calling the real Department of Environment, which was this squatted space. The night before, we had a meeting point and brought out the newspapers to give to lots of groups who were coming to distribute them, and within seconds of us arriving there with the van, unloading the 40,000 newspapers, the police arrived and arrested 3 of us and took away the newspapers. So this very, very clear way of not getting any of our communications out. 3 of us spent the day in the cells. This was political policing. This was clearly political policing. This was clearly manipulation to take away our story and create their story, and therefore destroy our social movement, which was at this very key moment that was leading up to what would become the ultra-globalization movement, bringing these compositions of difference together.
And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
What's really interesting about the job that we ended up with, kind of slightly randomly, because we are core participants in this inquiry. We have been since 2015. It's been rolling on for a decade, and then it finally came to this point, and this group of us were brought together. And although we haven't been given our own files in many cases, what we have seen is thousands of pages now of disclosure about the spying on Reclaim the Streets. And I mean, those documents covering kind of the shift that Britain's political police made from spying on the old left, the traditionally considered subversive organisations, the Marxist groups, the socialist groups, to more community-based groups and anarchist and environmental groups. And particularly in the case of the documents, we've seen Earth First, Reclaim the Streets, and the various groups that emerged out of those going into the 2000s. And in those 3,000 pages, we get this incredible insight into the political motivations. And they're glimpses, and a lot of it has to be interpreted. And I think it's worth saying that the resulting statement that we produced is nearly 400 pages long, not counting...
275, isn't it?
375, I think. Anyway, it's long. It's long. I can't remember the exact page count, but and that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast, is to try and draw out some of these key issues that that we've spotted in those files that we've seen and which will be coming out now. I just kind of wanted to say that because we're talking through these things and saying, and the police did this and the police did that. And the reason why we know that is because we've had advanced sight of these documents that are going to be being put to Jim Boiling next week and that are going to be published in this witness statement. So if anybody wants more information about that, they will be appearing on the inquiry website. There will be reports on the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance website, and there's lots of other ways that you can get more information about this.
It's also worth, following on from that, it's worth pointing out that the disclosure we have had has been lots and lots of documents, which has been partially revealed to us as a group, as RTS in the group, and then partly been revealed to us by documents that we've had because we were spied on individually, and we've had to put those things together as in a kind of patchwork style. But there's lots of information missing. So many groups and individuals applied participants because they knew or believed they'd been spied on and were refused permission. There's lots of information that could have been disclosed to them that would have been contributed to our understanding of our story and vice versa, and we may not see that, we may not ever see that. It's also true that people who are co-participants are sometimes disclosed documents which are relevant to other co-participants' story, but they're not allowed to talk to each other about the information in any of those documents. So sometimes we don't hear about things that are relevant to our story, even though it has been disclosed to somebody. So the way the inquiry is releasing information is not providing us with the full story, nothing like the full story. I mean, it's true that lots of people who were involved in Reclaim the Streets are not present and are not contributing to this process, to us trying to understand how we were spied on, who did it and what happened and what actions did they take. But also the state is denying us the ability to see all of that information, partly through wanting to protect its own assets and its own history, its own officers, its own processes, but also partly because they don't recognise the way that people work together and work in different movements and operate across the borders of time and groups. People, go into different campaigns. They move from one campaign to another, so they don't understand the way we operate, and they're not giving us information based on a kind of lateral kind of logical process.
The machine, body, the machine, and you've got to put your body.
And to give a bit of historical context of this period, so we're talking about the beginning of the 90s. Reclaim Street starts off in 93, then big first street party in 95, and 94 is the Zapatista uprising, which has a big huge effect on many people in the broad left movements, and so what comes out of that Zapatista uprising in Chiapas in 1994 is this idea of really bringing together differences, not lobbying, not being part of parties, having more autonomous politics and so on. And out of that process came a thing called the People's Global Action, and Reclaim Streets became part of this People's Global Action, which was a global network of grassroots groups that focused their action and direct action and forms of civil disobedience against institutions of capitalism and capitalist growth. And it was a movement, incredible movement, ranging from, because this is the beginning of the internet, so groups like this could begin to talk to each other without the mediation of NGOs and so on. And so you've got groups like landless peasants in Brazil working with squatters in Berlin, fisherfolk from Bangladesh working with township squatters in South Africa, and people like Reclaim Streets. And out of that, this network began to target summits, which became known as the kind of summit mobilizations. And Reclaim Streets in 1998, the G8 summit were coming to Birmingham, and Reclaim Streets called for a global street party, because at this time there was many street parties taking place across the UK and Europe, and we called for a global one. It was very successful globally. The action in the G8 in Birmingham was mildly successful in terms of the G8, but interestingly enough, there's not a lot of files around that. But what came out of that was the desire in 1999, a year later, to do another global day of action, and this time to not get everyone to go to the G8. The G8 that year was in Cologne, but to do it decentralized and to focus on financial districts. And the call out was to do street parties in financial districts and replace the sound of profit with the sound of pleasure. And so many of us in Reclaim Streets were doing the kind of global networking, but also the national networking and organising an action in the financial district while the G8 were meeting in Cologne on Friday, the 18th of June. It became known as J18 because it was an international thing and we had to work out how to say it. That idea of having a letter and a number then became a kind of regular thing in the movement. And the day was an extraordinary day. 8,000 people targeted the Liffey building, the London International Futures Exchange. People got inside the Liffey building with lots of actions in the morning. It all ended in £1 million worth of damage. Front page headline of the Financial Times was "Anti-Capitalists Besiege City of London." It was also the beginning of indie media, very early forms of getting videos and photos from other actions. That was unique at the time. It was an extraordinary day. It changed many, many, many people's lives. What is extraordinary is that the day afterwards, the police were all like, well, why did it kick off? Why did we got to the London International Future Exchange for 40 minutes, 8,000 people using this kind of choreography, using these 4 different coloured carnival masks. And the police said afterwards, and there was a kind of a government inquiry in Parliament, it kicked off and it got out of control because this group does not communicate with the police. Well, in 2011, when it found out that Jim Boyling was an undercover police officer, there were in fact 10 people who knew of the whole plan. And he was in that group of 10 who had met for an entire year planning the whole thing with a network of hundreds and hundreds of other people doing a lot of other work. But these 10 people knew the kind of logistics of where we were actually going, the London International Futures Exchange. So Jim Boyling knew everything. And now we have the notes. And we see, actually, that they were very interested in June the 18th. They put a lot of energy into it, the cops. And all the reports leading up to June 18 from the SDS basically said, do not give to city police. Even a detailed description of the day comes out 2 weeks before June the 18th, and it has this in big black and white, big letters, do not give to the City of London police. So, Carnival is when the world is turned upside down. This is definitely pretty upside down. Like, why the fuck? They allowed a riot to happen. They were planning the riot. Turns out Jim Boyling was actually bought the cars and drove the cars that blocked two of the roads that allowed the street party to happen. Why would they not give the stuff to the city police? We don't know for sure. That our assumption is there is a long conflict actually between the British state, the British Crown, and the kind of autonomous medieval finance centre. It's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict. The Metropolitan Police have always wanted to abolish the city police. So we think it's part of that kind of conflict between the two police forces because Jim was working with the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police wanted to, fuck over the city police, and that's actually what happened. They blamed the city police for what happened, and turns out in the end that the law was changed, and that actually, I think when Occupy happened in 2011, that actually it was the Metropolitan Police that did the public order in the city, because before it wasn't the Metropolitan Police who did it, the city police would do it. Anyway, there's many more details we could talk about, but one of the questions we really want to ask Jim is why was the city police not given this information? And, you were knowingly allowing a riot and planning a riot in one of the world's most important financial districts.
Put your body, put your body, put your body, put your body.
What I wanted to talk about is this issue of how deeply involved Jim Sutton was in organising and Reclaim the Streets. So we know that both Jim Sutton and his successor, Jason Bishop, were treasurers of Reclaim the Streets. They had control of the bank account. They were the people that you went to get money to print flyers or to get money to finance whatever thing needed needed paying for. And this is a bit of a pattern that we've seen with undercover officers throughout the public inquiry, of getting themselves into positions where they're not simply observing, they are actually altering and impacting on the way that decisions are made in groups. So, Jim Sutton being in that secret 10-person logistics group gave him essentially more power within Reclaim the Streets than many of the genuine activists who were working towards organising on J18. And there's big political questions about the legitimacy of the police coming in and interfering. And in this burgeoning People's Global Action and this global movement, Jim Boylan was sometimes one of the people who went in representation of Reclaim the Streets to other countries to meet other activists, and this role that they took, and so there's big questions about what they used that role for, and some of the interesting stuff that we address in the witness statement is the correlations that we found between reports filed by Jim Boylan and smear stories that started appearing about Reclaim the Streets in the press, specifically after the events of June the 18th. And what we also see is some really, I've been investigating these undercover policing operations for quite a long time now, but I was actually surprised by some of the documents that we got in Reclaim the Streets that really set out in black and white the police plotting to undermine the ability of Reclaim the Streets to get its political message out there. So there are documents where they specifically discuss the feasibility of raiding the print shop where our publicity material is being printed. They decide not to do this because it's actually Jim Boylan as treasurer who is paying for the material, and he's responsible for picking it up, and they decide that he's too close to it, and if the print shop is raided it might end up casting suspicion on him. So they then concoct a plot to harass and raid the houses of a list of people which they carefully put together to include people who are key organisers in the upcoming event, which by this point was the May Day 2000 guerrilla gardening event, but also people that they know are not involved, because that way, basically they don't want us to think that their intelligence is too good because it might make people suspect. So they deliberately target people who are not involved in the organisation for harassment. And there's a specific line in that where they talk about the impact of harassing people who are organising these events, and how Uniform will be delighted to be let off the leash by Special Branch to basically just bother people, stop and search, raid houses, make people scared, make people demobilise, essentially, prevent us from getting our flyers out, and this starts with the arrest and seizure of the evading standards, but by early 2000 this is a explicit and unashamed police plot to undermine a group being able to politically organise. And so I think there's some really important questions to be asked about, what the role of the police actually is in public order policing and how that correlates. There's also some very interesting stuff. There's a development along those lines where they sort of move from the question of public order to the question of the potential for embarrassing Her Majesty's government and the potential for damaging UK PLC. So the idea of the potential for damage to the embarrassment to the government starts to come up around the G8. And then as we move into the 2000s and protests against arms fairs like Defence Systems and Equipment International, which is a massive international arms fair that takes place in London, the potential of damaging UK PLC and the economic interests of the United Kingdom. None of these are things that the police actually can do legitimately. Like they don't admit generally that this is what they were doing. They claim that they are there to prevent crime. They claim that they are there to prevent disorder. But in fact, there's very explicitly political motivations and extremely questionable secret political policing actions that are being taken around Reclaim the Streets, which it looks like contributed very significantly to the burnout and eventual disintegration of the group in the early 2000s.
I think it's worth putting that into the context of the Special Demonstration Squad's specific actions throughout its history and Special Branch's wider history and the police's role within society as a whole. There is evidence that SDS, intelligence gathered by the SDS on trade unionists was passed to blacklisting organisations. There is evidence, plenty of evidence to suggest that SDS undercover officers were sent to spy on campaigns for justice for people who've been killed by racist attackers or killed by the police or died in custody. Most of those people being sort of people of colour, black people, African people of Afro-Caribbean background or Asian background. There is a sense that the SDS's actions and the police's actions in those cases are both to defend the interests of sort of capitalism, business as usual, but also to sort of defend the reputation of the police against people who are questioning its actions. So it's going beyond the idea that you're preventing people from causing disorder to you're preventing people from asking awkward questions and bringing the police's name into disrepute and bringing causing possible damage to business.
Up to now, we've talked quite a lot about Jim Boyling and the role that he played within RTS, the information he had access to, the impact he had on our organising and on the group when he was part of it. What we haven't talked about yet is some of the other spycops that were sent and targeted, deployed into RTS as well. One of those, Jason Bishop, is due to give evidence to the inquiry a few weeks after Jim. We don't know his real name, we just know his cover name. But we do know that he was heavily involved in some of these groups like Disarmed Icy we've just been hearing about, and he was heavily involved in the guerrilla gardening action that took place on May Day 2000. And we heard evidence from GRD this week. This is another person who was spied on who's chosen to remain anonymous in this inquiry process, saying that he lent his van to Jason Bishop to use for the guerrilla gardening action. Jason was arrested during that time. The van was impounded by the police. When he eventually got his van back, he was driving down the road and realised the wheel nuts were a bit loose. So that must have happened while it was being held in a police pen. We've also got another co-participant who's involved in Reclaim the Streets who believes that Jason Bishop planted an incendiary device in his bag at an RTS meeting. These are really serious allegations that could have had a really serious impact on the safety and health of those activists, which is something we think the police were responsible for. And that's something the inquiry needs to investigate.
In the vast number of documents that have been disclosed to RTS, there are a lot of documents that relate to other groups or groups that kind of evolved from or spun off from RTS meetings. The reporting from Jason Bishop particularly kind of evolves into reporting about those groups and the kind of end of RTS and the emergence of groups like Disarmed Icy and the Wombles. You also see a lot of coverage reporting coming from the London Action Resource Centre, which is a social centre that people involved in Reclaim the Streets were involved in setting up, but it wasn't a Reclaim the Streets project as such. It's used by a lot of different groups for many different purposes, and those groups came into contact with Jason Bishop, Jim Boyling and Jackie Anderson, amongst other undercover officers, Rob Harrison, who basically hoover up whatever they encounter at that social centre. One particular piece of interesting reporting from Jackie Anderson early on, while the building was being renovated for the purpose of being used as a social centre, was reporting which describes in detail the access from the roof garden. Quite often see reporting that involves descriptions of the building and the layout and where things are stored and the type of locks and all that kind of stuff, which kind of begs the question, what is the purpose of that? And a few people so far have given evidence from different groups about break-ins and burglaries that have occurred in suspicious circumstances. Lark itself was burgled at some point. We have no idea, and there's no reporting to suggest that it was the police, but of course that isn't something that we're likely to have been disclosed. It's definitely a question that the inquiry should be looking at. And the break-in was from the roof garden, exactly as Jackie Anderson described would be possible.
I'm just wondering then if I say a few words about how this fits into the context of the wider scope of what the inquiry has been hearing about, and where I think what we say adds to what other groups have said, because I mean the inquiry, as has been mentioned, has been running for 10 years now, and the first several years were spent with the police arguing that they should be granted anonymity, because then they would so allegedly give much more honest testimony if no one knew who they were. But of course that would frustrate the ability of anybody to find out. So who were these people? Oh, that person who I thought was called Mark Stone actually turns out to be a spy called Mark Kennedy. Well, we do know about Mark Kennedy, but there are plenty who we still don't know about, and therefore there are all sorts of reasons why it's been really difficult to piece together this jigsaw, as was being described earlier. We're all getting little bits of jigsaw, which rather depend on whether we've got poor participant status, whether we are named in a particular document, or whether the group we're involved in is named in a particular document. And we've had pieces of this jigsaw that actually other people do mention, other people who have not got participant status, and therefore they don't get to see things, and therefore they would not be able to kind of interpret this stuff in the they're prevented from being able to add their insights into how to fit the jigsaw together. So it's a very frustrating process. But in the context, the key message I think that we've wanted to get across is a new one, because the inquiry is now being chaired by a guy called John Mitting, former judge. He took over from the first chair of the inquiry was a guy called Christopher Pitchford. He died. John Mitting took over, and he has heard lots and lots of evidence from other core participants going right back to when the SDS was formed in the 1968, about how they were spying on progressive movements, spying on justice campaigns for black people who were killed either in custody or by racists, or on anti-racist demos or whatever. He's been hearing about the police spies taking the names of dead children in order to have a fake story that they could back up with a birth certificate in case anyone got suspicious. He's been hearing about these police spies forming relationships, and in some cases having children with women that they were spying on, or indeed marrying women that they'd been spying on. He's been hearing all of that. The police have been acknowledging that that was terrible. They've apologised. Mitting has heard all that before. He does come across as being kind of bored of that. What I think we add is the police are still hanging on to this justification that they were doing what they were doing to prevent public disorder. And I think if there's one key point is that I think above all that we wanted to try and get across is that justification was completely spurious. As we've been saying in previous contributions, actually they were faced with intelligence that of what the plan was, and that it did not involve would not have resulted in disorder. They chose to thwart our plans so that disorder was more likely, not less. Time and time again, that's what they did. And that this was intensely political. It was in order to tarnish our reputation, for one thing. It seems also to have been this point about to strengthen their role. That they were preventing all these really dangerous things. Another thing that they've claimed to have prevented was an attempt to stop an oil tanker crossing the Dartford Bridge. There was a plan. It would have involved stopping an oil tanker at one toll booth on the Dartford Bridge, and Jim Boyling knew that. We've also got his intelligence on that, and yet they subsequently made out, when seeking a commendation for Jim Boyling, that they had thwarted this really dangerous plot that would have brought the whole of the M25 to a standstill. So they kept doing this, partly to kind of justify their own existence, to gain commendations, and also this point about to undermine the City of London police as well as tarnish us. So they were doing loads and loads of things, anything other than preventing disorder. I ended up being the one person who got called to actually give oral evidence. I agreed to give oral evidence before I knew that, so many other people in this room who might have been able to give much more useful oral evidence about parts of Reclaim the Streets' history that I wasn't involved in, but they didn't get called. So I ended up having to carry this sort of this role of representing a group for which, we never had representatives. That was the whole point of it. So there's been this uneasy thing about writing a statement where we knew that we couldn't represent a group that was no longer there to endorse this statement. We just had to submit it as a statement from some people who were involved in Reclaim the Streets, and then I was ending up giving my oral evidence as a person who was involved in a part of Reclaim the Streets' history. So we've been very aware of the limitations of what we can do. But if I, in giving my oral evidence, if I got that one point through to the chair of the inquiry, I hope that's what that was above all the one thing that I really set out to do above all.
On representation, the police reporting often conflates and misattributes actions of different groups and individuals to different organisations, often ones which the police are authorised to target. So a lot of the disclosure for RTS isn't necessarily about RTS at all. The weekly RTS meetings involve lots of people coming along and talking about what their group was going to do in the coming week, inviting people to come on actions. So a lot of those things kind of get conflated into the reporting. That has been good in terms of the disclosure. We've seen a lot of stuff about Her First, about the Wombles, which otherwise wouldn't be seen because the inquiry has not granted core participation status to those groups. So yes, I think Roger has taken more care to not non-represent RTS while speaking about the events than the police did, who would represent as much as possible as being about RTS. Long after RTS had ceased to really exist, they were reporting on RTS.
And essentially what they were doing was they were invoking the spectre of those incredible big Reclaim the Streets actions in order to attempt to justify the need for the kind of political policing that they were doing. There was there are numerous reports from long after RTS ceased to exist about the potential or the possibility for RTS to come back or for things to be RTS style. There's a very, very clear instrumentalisation of that to continue to justify the political spying that they were doing. I would really encourage people to read the witness statement that will eventually be published on the website and will be linked in the comments once it is, because it sets out whether you remember RTS, were part of RTS, or have no idea what RTS was. It sets out in a lot of detail what RTS did over the course of those 10 years, and also these insights that we've got into how the police were responding to that behind the scenes and what they were doing. There's a lot of places you can get more information about this. The inquiry hearings, Roger's evidence, is available on the inquiry website, and it will be on the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance YouTube channel.
If you go to spycops info, there should be links to all the different websites that exist, which include the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance, they include the Undercover Research Group, they include the link to the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance YouTube channel, which is where you can catch videos recorded by Tom Fowler before, during and after each of the hearings of the inquiry. So that's a really good way to keep up with what's happening if you don't want to watch the entire hearing, which is available on the inquiry website. As well as that, there's podcasts being recorded, there's social media including Instagram and X, and obviously there's Police Spies Out of Lives, which was a group set up by women who found out they'd been deceived into relationships by these undercover officers, and they've got their own social media and website and so on as well.
It should be said, I mean, we've not covered this because it's not what we're giving evidence about, but Jim Boyling deceived 3 of the women involved in RTS into relationships, and the evidence of those women is also going into the inquiry. We heard from Monica this week, and that would also be available to hear the evidence that she gave. And there's likely to be more evidence coming up in the future from Rosa and Ruth, who is the 3rd woman, and that will be published on the inquiry's website at some point, and there may be more oral evidence to come as well.
So, Jim Boyling is giving evidence to the public inquiry into undercover policing in February to 2026. He's going to give evidence over 4 days. It is worth watching his evidence. We've gathered a number of questions which are going to be put to him. Other people will have questions for him, not least the 3 women who he sexually abused on behalf of the state. We have a number of questions ourselves. We don't know how much he's going to answer. His attitude may not be very cooperative, since he remains the only undercover officer working for the STS so far to have actually been sacked on the basis of actions he took while undercover. So his attitude to the police is a little bit angry, to say the least. But we have a number of questions. We don't know if he's going to answer these questions. Some of those questions we have are: he claims repeatedly in his reporting and in his witness statement that he never proposed actions, he never proposed RTS actions. Nonetheless, he contradictorily describes himself as part of the inner circle responsible for planning major RTS events. Between 1996 and 2000, Jim Boyling was rarely not one of the people who knew all the plans for the upcoming actions. How can he reconcile this claim? Was he more active in steering RTS actions in certain directions? Secondly, bank fraud. Did he provide false documents to a bank to facilitate his role of treasurer of Reclaim the Streets? The Dartford Bridge scam. Did he exaggerate the threat of an action at Dartford Bridge to stop an oil tanker, to secure commendations for himself, and to increase the value of the SDS's kind of stock within the Met? A post-action note refers to this operation as the Dartford Bridge scam. Who was scamming who, Jim? May Day 2000. Did he participate in the planning of police searches designed in order to disrupt the event, with the main aim of confiscating leaflets so that propaganda and ideas could not be distributed, and to harass and target organisers? Withholding intelligence. Whose suggestion was it, recorded in documents that has been disclosed to us, that it would be necessary at some stage to consider passing nothing to uniform regarding the April 1997 March for Social Justice? How much was the SDS controlling what intelligence was passed to other parts of the police service, and in whose interest? Finally, we know that Jim Boyling acted repulsively and disgustingly as an individual, both in his personal relationships with activists and in the way that he spied on Reclaim the Streets and other groups. However, we're aware that he's part of a structure, who's part of a 50-year unit that operated targeted hundreds of groups, targeted thousands of individuals. It is not just about him, it is about his managers, it is about the people behind him. How much was the structure controlling what Jim was doing? How much of his activity was steered, for instance, by his immediate supervisor, head of the SDS in the 1990s, Bob Lambert, previously a SDS undercover himself in the 1980s, arsonist, adjunct provocateur, failed academic, sexual malfeasor, if that's and liar. Lambert has already given evidence about his own undercover activities, but is due to return to give evidence about his role as a manager in which he directly supervised Jim Boyling. How much of what Boyling was doing was steered by Lambert? How much was Lambert steering him to act in the similar ways to that Lambert himself had acted? And how much was Lambert, in fact, suggesting, pointing Jim in certain directions, pointing him to take certain actions?
It's been very emotional and for everyone involved, and it's often, a sense of were we just puppets in the hands of the state. And I think it's important to have a complex thinking around this, that we were infiltrated because we were doing stuff that was a threat. It was a threat to the state. It was a threat. We were part of a growing social movement that was using very different forms of organisation, very different forms of technology than ever before, and had the massive potential of disrupting the status quo and really pointing the issues not as an individual issues, but the issues as being systemic and around capitalism and around authority. And in a way, J18, we were the puppets of the state in some way, but also J18 inspired people 5 months later to do Seattle. People who had been organising around Seattle, when they heard that J18 happened, it gave them so much energy and so much power. And Seattle opened the door for a huge, huge, huge movement against neoliberalism and capitalism. And I, presently live on a place in France where we fought against an airport and won, and people are still inspired by stories of Reclaim the Streets in the movements in France. These stories continue to inspire, continue to give hope.
I think one of the things that really stands out for me from having done this is we've spoken to a lot of people, the people in the group that was writing the statement, but also talking to other people we know who were involved. And one of the things I've just heard over and over again, whether it's from people who were in that organising group or people who were part of the wider Reclaim the Streets group or people who just showed up to an RTS, is that the experiences of the contact people had with RTS changed their lives. It certainly changed mine, being involved in June the 18th, and I think that's the case for everybody who was involved in writing this witness statement.
And I think RTS was about the power that we have as people when we come together and we want to do something. And RTS, as we've heard already, came out of a whole movement of people that maybe had come together to oppose the government's plans to criminalise a lot of what we were up to. So the Criminal Justice Act had come in a few years before the street parties got really, really big. But having the government put out legislation that targeted specifically people who were squatting, people living in vehicles, people involved in putting on free parties and festivals, people involved in protest and in trespassing for all sorts of reasons, whether it was hunt sabbing or whether it was protesting about roads, and deliberately bringing all those people together into that movement that fought against the Criminal Justice Bill, that led to the same people wanting to come out and be involved in street parties and come along to RTS events because they were known to be positive, creative, and ultimately fun things to come to.
As well as being ways to confront the ways of life that we wanted to change.
Yeah, and as we've heard, RTS became an entire global movement, or part of an entire global movement at the time, and I think we were incredibly privileged to live through those times when it felt like a different world was possible. I'm not sure if I still feel like a different world was possible, but every single time I went to an RTS event, it reminded me that it was.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
I think finally it's worth saying that the state did feel threatened by the joy, the creativity, the kind of revolutionary potential of changing the way space is used, taking over the city, taking space for ourselves, creating alternatives that are not determined by commodities and capitalism. They conspired to destroy that. They sent police in to destroy it. They attacked it physically with uniformed police. It did not destroy the movement that existed. The movement that existed went on to migrate and mutate and go into different forms of resistance, and it continued to inspire things like the climate camps, like Extinction Rebellion, and groups all around the world are still inspired by those ideas, and another world is always possible.
It's just you never know when it's going to come around the corner.
Thanks for listening. You can find all the previous episodes at spycops.info, where you also find links to everything you'd ever want to know about this subject. Please help this series grow. Share it on social media. Give us a 5-star review on your preferred podcasting platform. Use the hashtag spycops to find the latest news and developments on most social media platforms.